Hey guys, I'm Val. So today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my Ice Shards build. I did use it briefly, but it was a lot of fun. Sadly, it's not really geared for the Gauntlet if that's what you're doing. It does work for all other gameplay. For the abilities, I'm using Teleport. This is our source of Unstoppable, and it will trigger T-Bolt's Will. For the next ability, I'm using Ice Armor. It gives you a barrier, and we use it as a defensive and for utility. While Ice Armor is active, 5% of your damage dealt is added to the barrier. Also, attacking vulnerable enemies contributes 50% more to the Ice Armor's barrier. And while Ice Armor is active, your mana regeneration is increased by 25%. For the next ability, I'm using Flame Shield. Flame Shield makes you immune to all damage for 2.5 seconds. It also grants 25% movement speed and 25% mana cost reduction. For the ultimate, I'm using Deep Freeze. Deep Freeze also makes you immune for 4 seconds, and it resets the cooldown of all your other abilities. When Deep Freeze ends, gain 10% of your base life as a barrier for 6 seconds for each enemy you froze, and it damages all enemies around you. Pretty much the entire screen will take damage. Next, I'm using Lightning Spear. This is another source of vulnerable. And for the main ability, Ice Shards, launch 5 shards. They deal 25% increased damage to frozen enemies. Ice Shards have a 40% chance to ricochet, and they always ricochet off of frozen enemies. Hitting an enemy with 5 shards will make them vulnerable for 2 seconds. For the enchantments, I'm using Ice Shards. This causes Ice Shards to automatically conjure and fly towards frozen enemies. And for the next enchantment, I'm using Firebolt. This causes all our abilities to apply burning damage, which will amplify our damage. For the gear, I'm using Harlequin Crest. It's not required. If you don't have this uber unique, I would suggest using the aspect Ever Living. You take 20 to 25% less damage from crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. For the chest, I'm using the aspect Shared Misery. When you hit a crowd control enemy, there's up to a 50% chance for that crowd control effect to spread to another unaffected enemy. This build already applies crowd control naturally from your main ability being a cold skill and the use of Frostburn gloves. This just helps to spread it faster. This aspect is used as a defensive. If everything's crowd controlled or frozen, they can't attack you. And on top of that, you do more damage while they are. For the gloves, I'm using Frostburn. This gives you a 25% chance to freeze enemies for 2 seconds. If you do not have Frostburn, you could use gloves with attack speed, critical strike chance, and plus skills to Ice Shards. For the aspect, I would use Accelerating, or Aspect of Control, which gives you 25% increased attack speed, or you deal up to 35% more damage to immobilized, stunned, or frozen enemies. For the pants, I'm using T-Bolt's Will. You deal up to 40% increased damage while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after. And you also gain 50% of your primary resource. So every time you use Teleport, you're going to increase your damage and gain mana. For the boots, I'm using Isu's Heirloom. Your critical strike chance is increased by up to 30% of your movement speed. For the main hand, I'm using Piercing Cold. Ice Shards pierce up to 4 times, dealing 20% less damage per subsequent enemy hit. For the offhand, I'm using Storm Swell. You deal up to 30% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while you have a barrier. Another good option would be the accelerating aspect here. For the rings, for the first ring, I'm using X-Files Corroded Signet. Your damage over time effects have up to 50% chance to erupt, dealing up to 40,000 damage of the same type to nearby enemies. This is really good for this build because with the enchantment of Firebolt, we will be applying burning damage to all enemies hit, and Ice Shards ricochet to other enemies. For the next ring, I'm using Talrashas. For each type of elemental damage you deal, gain up to 15% increased damage for 4 seconds. Dealing elemental damage refreshes all bonuses. This is going to essentially be a 45% increased damage buff at all times, as long as you're attacking something. And for the neck, I'm using Ancient Flame. While both bonuses from the Isu's Ferocity key passive are active, your attack speed is increased by up to 75%. For the skill tree, our basic attack is going to be Firebolt. I put 2 points into this. This is because our enchantment is Firebolt. For the core skills, I put 5 points in Ice Shards, 1 point in Enhanced and Destructive Ice Shards, 1 point into Devastation, and 3 points into Elemental Dominance. For the defensive skills, I put 1 point into Flame Shield, Enhanced, and Mystical Flame Shield, 1 point into Teleport, Enhanced, and Shimmering Teleport, 3 points into Glass Cannon, 1 point into Ice Armor, Enhanced, and Mystical Ice Armor, and then 1 point into Elemental Attunement, 3 points into Precision Magic. Lucky Hit is very important in this build. 1 point into Align the Elements, 3 points into Mana Shield, and 3 points into Protection, 1 point into Inner Flames, and 3 points into Devouring Blaze. This is going to increase the damage of the build significantly because most enemies will be burning or frozen. In the ultimate skills, we're going to be putting 3 points into Permafrost, or Frost, and Icy Touch, and then 3 points into Frigid Breeze. Cold damage against vulnerable enemies has up to a 20% chance to generate 15 mana. For the ultimate, Deep Freeze, 1 point into Prime and Supreme Deep Freeze, 1 point into Fiery Surge for extra mana regeneration. And the key passive we are using is Isu's Ferocity. This is currently bugged, where it will buff all your damage, not just fire. So Ice Shards will receive 25% increased critical strike damage and 5% increased critical strike chance against enemies that have above 50% life. And when you kill an enemy with a critical strike or hit a boss, you will be granted both bonuses for 3 seconds, which will in turn give us the 75% increased attack speed from the Ancient Flame aspect on our neck. For the construct, I'm using Flash of Adrenaline, Duration, and Tactical Support. And then Genesis. If you do not have Genesis, you can do Safeguard here. Next, I'm using Tempest, Resource Support, efficiency support, and arcing support. If you have Evernight, you would replace arcing support. Here's some short gameplay of a tier 100 vault, just to show you how the build works. I did make some adjustments. It now has 8 glyphs instead of 7. I wanted to maximize the damage output. For the Paragon board, you're going to go up and to the right. The first glyph is going to be Winter. Whenever you chill or freeze an enemy, you deal 3% increased cold damage for 10 seconds, up to 15%. This will stack and refresh, so it will be active at all times as long as you are attacking. It also buffs non-physical damage here and the resistances. We're going to go up, and our next board is going to be Enchantment Master. The glyph is going to be Elementalist. Dealing fire, cold, or lightning damage to an enemy increases all damage you deal to them by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking once per element. This will stack up to 15% increased damage and will refresh as long as you are attacking. It's basically a 15% increased damage buff. The next board is going to be Frigid Fate. We do take the legendary node here. You deal bonus damage to vulnerable enemies equal to 10% of the total amount of your bonus damage with cold, up to a maximum of 30%. And the glyph is going to be Flame Feeder. You deal 10% increased direct damage to burning enemies. The next board is going to be Icefall. We take the legendary node here as well. Your frost skills deal 15% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. This bonus is doubled if the enemy is also frozen. And the glyph is going to be Control. You deal 10% increased damage to slowed or chilled enemies, or 20% increased damage to stunned or frozen enemies. We're going to go back up to the Frigid Fate board and go up the Burning Instinct board. We do not take the legendary node. The glyph here is going to be Unleash. After spending 50 mana, you deal 7% increased damage against 7% mana regeneration. This is important because we burn through mana really quickly, so we need all the mana regeneration that we could get, so we don't have any downtime between ice shards. The next board is going to be Searing Heat, and the glyph is going to be Exploit. Dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases your damage by 1% for 6 seconds, stacking up to 10%. The next board is going to be Ceaseless Conduit. The glyph is going to be Destruction. Critical strikes increase all damage the enemy takes from you by 2% for 10 seconds, up to 12%. This will stack and refresh as well. So a review of this build is it's actually really fun. It can do all content. Only downside is mana regen. It's a different playstyle than Blizzard. Only things in front of you will be hit most of the time. If I had to rate it against other Sorceress builds, I'd probably give it an IB or A tier. You can do everything. It's just not the best at all things. If you wanted to do Gauntlet, I would not use this build. I would definitely use something else. I know Blizzard seems to be at the top with Ball Lightning builds and Arclash builds, but this build will work for all other game content. Can be reworked for that, just not worth it. It's not going to keep up with those other builds mentioned. If you guys have any questions or comments, I'd be happy to answer you guys down below. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate the support, and I'll see you guys next time.